my perspective of AstraZeneca at that time, as well as most of the other global pharma companies, is that they needed to address what could be done to shorten development times, to make smart decisions, to make smart go or no-go decisions. And like many large pharma companies, started to try to replicate organizational structure and quick decision-making that they saw in biotech. Difficult to achieve that overnight, but let's talk about your transition to AstraZeneca and the role or the roles you had there, and both in terms of, yes, your achievements, but people development, organizational development, and at that point.
Sure. So I joined AZ as a global head of clinical for oncology, and took a series of projects which were a portfolio which was pretty healthy, but oncology was not, the focal point because the company was still a cardiovascular and Nexium, company, and they had been a series of failures, and not necessarily well understood lessons learned from these failures or difficulties. But the lessons I learned at AZ were essentially can be bucketed in two things. One have to do with leadership, and one have to do with what is pharma itself and how you implement that in how you run the operations and empower and support people. So from a leadership, what I obviously over these years, as I gradually pushed the portfolio and grew in responsibility, there were three things which were really, very important, and which I applied from the knowledge I had at the time, which was almost 20 years on serving at the project team level, meaning being on the front and having delivered so many submissions already there, but by myself. I applied the lessons of what worked well and what I would have liked to receive from the environment, when I was in these project level. And there were three things. One is to have a clear understanding what governance is, and governance, and ever since I've used that definition, is governance does only four things. One is to understand and define the risk. So not only take at face value what's being said, but to have a deep understanding of the risk, so that at the portfolio and company level, then the governance can own the risk level and ascribe the risk level for your project of So this is something, and you cannot ascribe and define the risk you want to take unless you understand it. So that's the number one. The number two, is understand the time, and not the time that you want, but the time which is real. And very often, the governance is, or you have many stories about, say, no, a team asks for 9 months, and then the leaders come back and say, find a way to make it in 6 months. I've always found this highly ineffective, because that's not the reality. The reality is, what do you need what does it need to do it differently? And ask the people, on what they want, and then hold them to account and hold yourself to account to that time. And then if time means that the other thing has to be deprioritized or done differently, then you take, as a governance, the responsibility for that. And thus you hold the back of people who have defined for themselves what is their best possible performance. And that translates into a time element. And then you obviously have the means, which is, both the dollars, but also the people and so on and so forth. And that is a governance decision, how much you put to this. Do you go at risk, or do you go gating, and so on and so forth? And there's not one solution fitting for all. You just have to think very systematically with this three different things, which is the risk and uncertainties, the time and the means. And obviously all of this is towards a value. And actually, the value you pursue, is the least important, is very often presented as the most important driving factor. But in my mind, it's the least important. What you need to have is a good value, and then everything you do is commensurate to the value. And the value can be a commercial value, it can be a reputational value, it can just be a human value. One of the drug, has been a drug which has been repurposed and failed everywhere except for Hutchinson progeria syndrome, which is a very, very ultra-rare genetic disease. That's the rapid aging syndrome of kids who die of old age at the age of 10 or 12. And there are, at any single time point you have between 10 and 20 kids in the world living with this. So obviously the means you apply to pursue that indication are very different from other means. But you still do it. And that is the role of governance, to understand all of these elements and then create the framework to empower the teams and then hold them responsible for it, but take all. So that's one thing that I experienced before, and I gradually instituted at AZ, and obviously that's a playbook that I was ready to play at Daiichi Sankyo. And that's number one, is clear governance, but that doesn't work on its own. I mean, there are two other things which are really important, which one is to have a structured advisory process. A lot of pharma suffer from the fact that the function have an opinion. So you take regulatory and stats and clinical operation and medical and clinical pharma. I mean, you name it, everybody has an opinion, and the project team struggles to really reconcile that. And either they keep recycling because you have leaders who keep asking the same question, or they go for the least demanding common denominator, or they take time. But it is a process by which the project team is assumed to be able to take down from the top of the different function or external input and distill that down and make the best possible recommendation. And then the next expectation is to go to governance and to seek ratification. And I found from the project themselves this to be highly ineffective. And what I really enjoyed, I created when I was on the project side and then instituted at AstraZeneca, and certainly also actually a lot on AstraZeneca, was a very structured governance where the senior leaders outside the project would make themselves available to the project at the project request in a manner which is such that it's safe. And by safe, it means that there's no format, there's no minutes, meaning that there's nothing that you can say, I told you to do this, and it's only valid for a question, not for ratification. So it's not about, do you agree with my plan, but this is what I'm struggling with. And brainstorm and bring internal and sometimes a structured external internal advisory process which feeds into the project team so that the project team can unlock itself and has actually much, much better ability to define a path forward and then go to governance. And I found this to be extremely powerful. And the Tagrisso team, for instance, which obviously went very, very fast, used that process on a weekly basis, access to internal and sometimes external, and just for question. And so that's the second thing, which is from a leadership's perspective to ourselves leaders, sit in our right place, which is a source of experience and viewpoints, but not a source of telling the people what to do. And thus, that leads me to the third thing, which is to empower the project team to essentially be responsible for what they wanted to do and always come up with one or two options, which was much, much easier because they had that advisory process. And come to governance and then just hold them to a high-performing team. You don't monitor, you rely on their ability to tell you when they are unable to do what they said they would do. And you never tell them, oh, please go for faster. And not, you say, what do you need to do your best? Because the driver is, we do all what is humanly possible to deliver our science for patients. So these are the three things I learned from a leadership perspective over these years at AstraZeneca. So I don't know if this is helpful, but this is how I would summarize it.